Good evening, everybody, and welcome to day 4 of Black Girl Freedom Week. My name is Lorelei Williams. I use the She Trilogy, and I am Executive Director of the Warner Music Blavatnik Family Foundation Social Justice Fund. I am honored and thrilled to partner with Grantmakers for Girls of Color in this important and timely call for $1 billion in investment for liberated futures for Black girls, femmes, and gender-expansive youth. And I am so honored to share this time and space with Dr. Ramatu Bangura, who is the founding executive director of Children's Rights Innovation Fund, I'm getting it, and also just a trailblazer in decolonizing the child rights space. I'm also equally thrilled to present Kenya Bryant, who is the manager for philanthropic partnerships at Estee Lauder Foundation and who brings a track record of 8 years and multi-million-dollar investments advancing racial equity, justice, and education. So thank you, ladies, for being here with me today. We have a pretty full agenda and really going to anchor our conversation in this critical question of why we need to center Black girls, femmes, and gender-expansive youth as we resource racial justice and racial equity movements. And that question of investment is really critical because we know that giving to women and girls of color averages about 0.5% of the $60 billion that foundations invest every year. And of that 5%, roughly $5.34 is invested in every woman and girl of color. And we know for Black girls, that's even less. We also know that Black women-led organizations and organizations focusing on Black women and girls tend to average $50,000 in their operating budgets and only typically receive grants of $15,000. And so we know this question of resourcing is critical because you can't build and sustain movement with limited resources. And so I love the framing that Grantmakers for Girls of Color gives us this beautiful question of what does it look like to resource Black girls like we want them to win? So that's one of the critical questions we're anchoring ourselves in today. And just thinking about what might 2030 look like if we invested in the radical genius of Black girls, femmes, and gender-expansive youth and invested in their power. So to help us answer these questions, I'm turning my attention now to Dr. Ramatu Bangura and Kenya Bryant. And I always think, it's important for us to anchor ourselves in purpose, right? This is big work. And a lot of times this funder role, we stand at a gatekeeper position between privilege and power, poverty and marginality, all in the same breath, in the same conversation some days. And so I want to know for you all, how do you resource yourself in this work and in whose name do you do this work?
That's a lovely question and a great way to start by calling in those that sustain and support and feed us. And so I bring in the names of my dear cousin who was lost to domestic violence in Doraseri Kamal. I call in my grandmothers and Amiwero and Haja Isidiki. I call in my baby girl, Alima, and they feed and sustain me and they remind me every day, especially on the days when it's not so fun, to remain in this work and to do this work. So thank you for that question.
Thank you,
absolutely.
absolutely.
Yeah, similarly, I love that question. I would say the folks who ground me in this space are my grandmothers as well, Sandra White, Mildred Robinson, and my great-grandmother, Ernestine Dickens. I think the women who uplift and drive my family lineage have definitely carried us. And I always remain humble to have them in here every space that I enter in.
Thank you. Yes, and I come from a long line of fire-filled women, and so I call on them as I do this work, and that spark has traveled to my baby girl, who has, by 4 years old, endured more than maybe people 4 times her age or 10 times her age. And so with that spark in mind, let's spark our conversation. And so I want to talk about these questions of money, power, accountability, and sustainability.
Mm-hmm.
I want to think about, for each of you, how do you contemplate these questions in your work and in your investment strategies to fuel and empower Black girls, femmes, and gender-expansive youth? Kenya, why don't we start off with you?
Sure, happy to. So These words, they come up every day, for sure. I think for me personally, my approach to philanthropy, having come from a space of being a grantee in my former work, really kind of deconstructing what traditional philanthropy means is very important. I think when you think of money, that's who has the power. And for me, my approach to philanthropy is very relational, making sure that we're meeting folks where they are, asking folks what they need, or I guess, how could we be in partnership with you versus kind of the flip side of things. At Estee Lauder companies, and particularly at the foundation, really making sure that we've taken a very intentional approach to how we support racial equity, I think, at large. And the company made a $10 million commitment over 3 years to kind of show that investment over the long term. So when you say sustainability, it's really, how are we in this for the long haul? We've recently changed the strategy of our foundation to take on some of these corporate initiatives under the foundation. So moving forward, our existing pillars of girls' education and women's advancement, for example, environment, health, et cetera, are now really looking at these spaces through an intersectional lens that lifts race and gender equity. So I think it's very important moving forward in how we approach it, and infusing my own personal, I think, approaches really support the work as well.
Yes, absolutely. That question of sustainability is key, right? There was such a, influx of resources in this movement of racial reckoning. And that question of how do we sustain that flow of funding is really critical. Ramatu, how do you contemplate some of these issues in your?
I think I come to philanthropy after, it's hard to count anymore, but probably 20 to 25 years of doing grassroots work with girls in community. And so money was not always one of the tools we had in our arsenal to do that work. And so coming into a space where I get to deploy resources, it's important for me to be really explicit, because I know for some of us, particularly as Black women, as folks of color, that there's a lot of shame and discomfort around questions of money. And so what I try to start with is an understanding that money is not power, but it facilitates power. And so if we can name that clearly and be explicit about it so that folks don't have to say it to you, but you come in as a funder with that orientation, then the question and the conversation then changes to, how do we build power together? How are we going to use these resources at our disposal to move money to our people and to our girls? And so we have an opportunity in this space, and spaces like Grant Makers for Girls of Color, to build out those ecosystems of support so that we understand that accountability and sustainability means that power is dispersed, that power is not sitting in any one place, but that we're putting money in lots of places so that our young people and our girls, especially our Black girls and femmes and gender nonconforming folks, that they can access power and resources in lots of places. And that we know the danger, particularly in philanthropy, of resources being concentrated in singular spaces. So it's critically important that we step into the power that money offers, not as defining who we are, but actually facilitating the vision for liberation that we have for Black girls and gender nonconforming youth.
Yeah, thank you. I love that idea of money as energy, right? And really, how do we direct that and disperse it, right? So it's anchored in multiple places and multiple people. And I think for me too, trying to think about other forces and sources of power, I think often we anchor this in the idea of currency. And there's so many other forms of currency, particularly that Black girls and women possess, and I think that needs to be added to the balance and to the ledger when we think about power and moving money. So yeah, I wanted to ask you, Kenya, just as we delve a little bit deeper, both of you occupy such unique niches in philanthropy and do such really phenomenal work and are brilliant philanthropic strategists. And so this is a great opportunity for folks who are listening in to learn a little bit more about your particular strategies. And so Kenya, you're operating at a place at Estee Lauder where I'm sure there must be interesting dynamics around colorism, around cosmetics, around consumerism and capitalism. How are you navigating all of those different dynamics as you build your own funding strategy? And how have you ultimately been able to make the business case for funding Black girls and women?
Yeah, that's a great question. Some of the points that you made earlier on, Lorelei, around kind of how much money is attributed to Black and brown girls is $5.48 per person. And I remember attending the Pocket Change Report conference that I believe it was Teresa Younger, Dr. Monique Morris, Kimberly Crenshaw, folks were on the call talking about the Ms. Foundation's report and really like unveiling all of that. And it wasn't something I was surprised to hear. I think the delivery and to see it spelled out in that way was where it became hurtful almost, and really to kind of digest, like, I have a role in this and I can completely change how we approach our philanthropic giving with this in mind. If anything, it gave me the tools, it gave me the data, it gave me the jargon to use to tell my senior leaders why this was a necessary space for us to be in and why it was important. And I think when you really think about women and girls of color and gender expansive youth, like we set trends. Like we are the folks who, especially within the music, fashion, beauty industries, are the ones who are telling folks what's hot, right? And so, like, if anything, we should be sought after, we should be supported in all means. So I think with all of that in mind, knowing that I was able to influence kind of how we were able to go about the work was super important. Specifically to your question about making the business case, that's one I hear often. And two spaces that I leverage when approached with that question is really around our consumers, right? If we're trying to tap into the Gen Zs and the millennials and the future consumers, folks are super savvy about how they're spending their dollar. We want to plug into that. We need to have a pulse on that audience and that demographic, myself being a part of that demographic, right? And so we are becoming a more and more multicultural world, and that's something that we need to digest and accept. And secondly, when we're thinking about this from a corporate lens, investors are paying attention. When you're looking at like the ESG, environment, social, and governance policies that a lot of these corporations are, putting out, many investors are making sure that they're paying attention to that and seeing how these strategies and investments are playing out within the corporate space and aligning themselves with organizations that are doing that work, right? And doing it from a place of intention. So it would behoove any sort of corporate entity to not be in these spaces and having these conversations specifically around social justice and equity.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I think, there is so much to be said for Black girls and femmes as trendsetters, right? And to think that there's so much knowledge and genius within this body, this population of girls. And also just thinking, I have Lonnie Guinier, she's just in my spirit a lot lately. She's a very important mentor of mine, but, her and Gerald Torres's book on the miner's canary. And just thinking about, how that canary really served to warn the miners about the conditions in the mines and, whether the air was poisonous or was, people could breathe. And just thinking about, not just looking at Black girls as trendsetters, but also looking at us in some regard as that canary, if the conditions in society are such that we can't breathe, people can anticipate that, when the conditions for Black girls and femmes and gender expansive youth are improved, the air is better for everybody, and so I think that's part of that business case as well, that this idea of a linked fate, and speaking of linked fate, Ramatu, I wanted to think about this idea of global Black girlhood, right? We know from Brooklyn to Brazil to Benin, Black girls, there's a certain ethos that we share, a certain strength, a rhythm, but there's also really unique, important nuances that we can't overlook, right? Mm-hmm. And so as a funder who has your eye on building power with young people of African descent across the diaspora, what are some of the key issues that you see facing those populations and how are you addressing them?
I think just to say that again, the Black girlhood is global. And I think that is, unfortunately, in certain funding circles, a truth that has yet to be accepted. As we began our work at CRIF, we're a new fund, we're a participatory fund, and we started our inaugural work to focus on the ways in which racism and colonialism are harming children and not as a thing that children experience through adults, but directly by design, racism and colonialism harm children. And one of the things that I have to remind folks, sometimes I got to remind Black folks, is that when they stole bodies from the shores of West Africa, they did not leave Africa alone. That we sit with the remnants of colonialism, and we sit with the very gendered and patriarchal realities of colonialism still. And so in this first inaugural portfolio where we said we want to raise this question explicitly, not as a sidebar, but as a central core function of our work, we wanted to do that work with other young people. So we brought young people together from Gambia, from Benin, from Sierra Leone, where my people are from Peru, from Brazil, from Colombia, from Barbados, from Oakland, California. And we put them in a virtual space together and said, let's talk about this question of race and colonialism. And we, still as people that love young people, but wondered whether or not they would have something to talk about in that space. And they ran with it. And the girls that we spoke to talked about all the ways they saw their struggles as connected globally. They talked about patriarchy, and they understood that it does not respect boundaries. So we got to stop respecting national boundaries. They talked about violence and in their homes, in their schools, in their neighborhoods. They talked about interpersonal and police violence. They talked about the school system's tendency to render them invisible. They talked about the detrimental effects of colorism. And they talked about the ways in which their hair and their beauty is unrecognized very often, even in spaces that are predominantly Black. They talked about the land grabs of wealthy folks that are displacing their families and their communities. And this was happening across the diaspora, so that we know that these issues that we see in the US are actively lived by folks that are across the diaspora. And it may be that the conditions are slightly different, but there's actually not that much difference, not nearly as much difference as we would like to imagine. And so what we do in our work is we attempt at every level to engage young people transnationally in our strategy. And we believe that they need to be talking to each other. We think that, again, we don't respect the national boundaries that it seems like, folks on the right are not respecting national boundaries, but for some reason, we're real caught up in keeping things to national boundaries. And it's to our detriment, because the forces that we're up against are global and we're fighting locally. And so we have to lift up that work to the global level. And the girls know this. And whenever they get in space together, the first thing they do, the minute we figure out the translation and interpretation, and they begin talking to each other, they're sharing and they're connecting around all the things that we as grown women, like, hey girl, your hair, and hey girl, this, as an entry point. And then they get into the real challenges of their lives. And I dream of the space where we can back off and then let them strategize and really allow for the space for them to tell us what the way forward is. But that's what we try to do in our work, is to build and create and shift rooms and spaces to accommodate their brilliance, and then let them work, and then put money where they tell us we need to be putting money. So that's how we think about that work. But at every point in turn, we look to do work transnationally, and not just because it serves somebody elsewhere, because it serves us, and it makes our movement stronger, and it makes our young people stronger. And so it's critically important to how we approach our funding.
No, absolutely. And, I love how you talked about this idea of just giving them the space, right? And one of the things that's so critical in this work too is translation. I wonder if you can talk, for some of the funders who work domestically, but are recognizing this global sort of shared struggle and want to connect and link into this work, what would you recommend as they try to pivot from a domestic focus to more of a global focus?
I believe start with the infrastructure, and infrastructure means a committed bodies, committed minds, committed hearts to language justice, and ensuring that folks that are speaking languages that are not English are able to not only communicate with you, because I think we get the idea that we need to figure out how they communicate with us, but how can they communicate with one another? And so that is a very significant part of our work. So we engage with a language justice coordinator who helps us think through all of our written materials, helps us think about all of our spaces, the things that we take for granted, like I can put a PowerPoint deck up on a screen and do a presentation, and we have to rethink all of that. Is that necessary? Does that facilitate communication? And those are the questions that we have to build in. We have to look at our timelines and what we anticipate we're able to do, because building in language justice requires time. We have to build in things, economic justice in that work. So economic justice and language justice are closely connected. So for our grown people, for an example is, we put all of our young people, when we do virtual meetings, in a hotel. We put them in a hotel because it means that they have a greater likelihood of having stable Wi-Fi. And that stable Wi-Fi allows for us to have eight interpreters on the line to make sure that folks can talk with, not only with each other, but with us, but with each other. And so these are all of the things we have to build in. And what I'm really excited about in philanthropy and in social justice spaces, that we're starting to see that, and we see folks that are taking that mantle up, and that becomes, you can hire a language justice coordinator, which I think is a powerful tool. And so it is a heavy lift. And I think the biggest mistake we make is not recognizing that at the outset and dedicating the resources to that work. But the payoff is rich, and it adds a layer of validation to your work, and make sure that there's, to that question of sustainability, that we're able to sustain relationships, because movement is really about relationships. Movements is about people that are connected to one another, who feel accountable to one another, who are willing to stand in the gap and enlist each other in each other's struggles. And if we cannot build the relationships to do that, we're not maximizing the potential of the resources we're putting out there. And so it is the infrastructure that needs to be built in. And it means, as an institution, you have to be in connection with other organizations that are also trying to do the same thing, because then you can share those names, you can share those contacts, you can share those tactics and those tools. So that would be the first thing that I would offer up.
Thanks, Ramatu. So in the spirit of sharing names, contacts, tools towards transformation, I wanted to ask both of you, Grant Makers for Girls of Color has been asking this really phenomenal question on all their socials. What would you do with 1 billion for Black girls? How would you invest that to build the power and, support the creativity and freedom dreams of Black girls, femmes, and gender expansive youth? So how would you do that? What would be your first order of business?
I'm calling on what Ramatu said earlier. Give it to them. I think the experts are the folks who, in a lot of our spaces we are serving, to give them the resources, to give them the authority, agency, et cetera, to carry out. They know what they need, and they know what will allow them to thrive. We just kind of have to sit back and follow their lead. So yeah, I'd say give it to them.
Word. And Ramatu.
I'm like, ooh. I would, move the money. Just please don't hire. What I'm telling you not to do first is hire a ring of consultants.
What you're not going to do is.
No, what you're not going to do is hire $300,000, $400,000 worth of consultants to tell you what to do with this money. So that's what we're not going to do first. And I think to that end, move the money, but move the money to Black girls and femmes. Offer them space to be with one another. That means travel. That means lodging. That means data for folks that live in spaces that are not connected virtually in the way that they should to the internet. So that means data. That means time to sit and be with one, to play, to listen to music, to dance, to laugh, to find joy. I think that's where I would start. So spaces where you can call it what you want, a conference, a gathering, somebody's house, a park, something.
A kitchen table.
Spaces, kitchen table, whatever that is, somebody's porch, somebody's stoop, whatever it takes for people to be with one another, especially coming off of this pandemic. We miss each other. And I think that is a beginning of movement, is to really have spaces and opportunities to kind of touch and be connected and talk and build trust, because we know that is also what divides movement, is a lack of trust. So really the opportunity to connect. I think to really, if we have $1 billion, we don't have to put all those barriers we put up that are about scarcity. So if you have an idea, you have resources for that idea. How much distance do we put between that idea and its reality because of money? very often. So to spaces to see those ideas come to fruition, but also spaces to be mediocre, to fail, to get it wrong, to make mistakes, and to do that in loving support and loving intergenerational support. So I think that's important. And then I would offer up just some money to go be free. I think so much of our really great ideas come from, you know, opportunities to travel, opportunities to go someplace you've never been before. I think that we oftentimes put so much pressure. Once we get access to resources for girls, for Black girls and femmes, we say, oh Lord, so now y'all got to do everything and you can't get it wrong because we might not get any more. And so to remove, if we can, whatever we can do to remove that scarcity mindset, to allow for their brilliance to come through uninterrupted is, I think, what I would do with $1 billion.
Yeah, thank you. Absolutely. Kenya, I love what you were saying about, you know, really turning to Black girls as those consultants, right? And then paying them the money and letting them really direct and drive strategy. And Ramatu, just want to echo what you're saying, which is essentially that being together is the medicine. Right. And that's the place that alchemy can start to take shape. And then, you know, really I see, and we all see, you know, trust as a bedrock and a ground zero for transformation. And so it sounds like the first order of business is really creating those spaces where we can just dream together, right, and be together. As I thought about the question, because I got wind that y'all might turn my questions back on me, which has been known to happen. I used to be called amongst my friends when I was growing up because I had 20 questions. But, you know, just thinking about, you know, if I had $1 billion, like, what would I want to do? And I think about this threefold, like 3 R's, right? So funding resistance, funding resilience, and funding renaissance. And so when I think about resistance, it's all the things that so many Black feminist funders are resourcing and doing well, right? In so many ways, Black women are about the business of saving democracy right now, you know, but thinking about, you know, the policy advocacy pieces and the push to roll back, you know, so many of these efforts and retrenchment of voting rights, of abortion rights, and, you know, just Black freedom on so many levels. So that resistance piece is key. And then I also think about resilience. It's so fundamental, right? That place of connecting to our joy, but also connecting to culture as medicine and connectivity. Thinking about health in a really holistic way, right? We saw how, you know, our communities were decimated by the pandemic and are being decimated by the global pandemic of racism and systemic racism, essentially. But to think about, you know, one of the people I love is Adrienne Maree Brown, and she talks about emergent strategy. And I think resilience is a big part of that, you know, thinking about how we can become more flexible, more adaptive, and really understand how to navigate the terrain as, you know, from this place of, you know, not necessarily always needing to be in this staunch position of resistance, but what are we building to replace the structures? You know, everybody talked about with COVID, oh, let's not go back to normal, because it wasn't working for us. So where is that space for innovation? And then finally thinking about the 3rd R for me, which would be renaissance. You know, how do we usher in, how do we leverage technology? How do we leverage cryptocurrency, even, you know, new forms of organizing that we haven't necessarily thought about? And so those places, to me, anchored in that being together and that dreaming together, would really be fundamental.
And it funds the ecosystem, right? Like it funds the community building that I think all of us really center in our work, that grounds us, of course, but then also just continues to keep the pressure on to move the work forward.
Yeah, I love that, because I've always bet on Black women, particularly Black girls, Black femmes. Put us in a room, somebody's gonna do some work, even if you say just relax. You know, don't do anything. There's no pressure. Somebody's going to come up with some idea. It has never failed. That changes the game. And I think if we can just, we don't have to put on white supremacy's urgency. We have our own. And so I think the degree to which we make space for just us to be, we will come up with the solutions, because we just do. It's what we do. But we deserve to rest and to connect in the midst of that too.
Absolutely. I'm a big fan of the NAP ministry, for those of y'all who know. That's a critical piece of all of this as well.
Very important.
And you can't dream if you don't rest, right?
Sure enough.
Nope.
Well, I want to thank each of you for spending time in conversation, and just urge everyone who's listening to really attune to this call to action to move 1 billion to Black girls, femmes, and gender expansive youth. You can see all the creativity and brilliance at work in the work of both Ramatu and Kenya and so many others. Big shout out to Grant Makers for Girls of Color and so many other organizations who are represented here, and all of the just brilliance that has been represented over these last 4 days. It's been such a pleasure. And I'm like you, Ramatu, I'm always going to bet on us.
Always.
We got each other. We all we got.
And so